Hey everyone, welcome back to the Full Circle podcast. Today I'm joined with Shirley Waldron. Shirley is a partner at Delva Patman Redler in London, who are leading party wall surveyors. And Shirley is also a qualified architect and a member of the RIBA. So welcome, Shirley.
Thank you, James.
How are you doing today? You good?
Yeah, not bad. All things considered.
Good. So I'm going to get straight into it today. How did you sort of get started in the architecture industry?
Well, I think it was something that I'd aspired to for a long time. I think, thinking back, um, when I was about 12 or 13, it's something that I talked about with my parents and their friends, and it's just something that I focused on. Um, I used to like looking at buildings, thinking about
Yeah.
interiors, that kind of thing. So that's really how it all started. Um, and I suppose the logical progression was to make my O-level choices based on that decision. And that's really what I did. From a young age, I was focused on that and took all decisions to try and get me to where I wanted to be. That's really how it happened.
So it's literally sort of from the get-go, you knew you wanted to be an architect pretty much.
Well, I originally thought I wanted to do interiors, but then
Yeah.
I spoke to some people and they said, just aim a bit higher than that and go for architecture. So really, there you go, aiming for the top. I
Yeah.
didn't know it at the time, but yeah, it was a good decision.
It's quite a weird one I've found recently with say with being a part one. I think you're always sort of focused on getting to your part two, and then when you're a part two, you always want to sort of get your part three. Do you ever find that say when you qualified that it's like you've done all these like checklists and you're sort of were you thinking sort of what's next now from here after you've got the sort of title after 7 or 8 years, however long it was to become an architect?
Gosh, well, for me, I actually took quite a long time to get my part three. By
Yeah.
the time I'd done my part two and was working in practice, I have to say I was a little bit disillusioned, but I
Hmm.
knuckled down, and it actually took me 12 years from leaving university or leaving Brighton, which is where I studied, to getting
Yeah.
my part three. It took me 12 whole years. And I wouldn't recommend that to anyone, actually, leaving it that long. But what I found is that people were saying to me things like, yes, but are you a real architect? Have you actually done? And I kind of had to admit, no, I'm not a real architect. And I
Hmm.
hated that. I hated the fact that I'd done all that work and I still couldn't call myself a real architect, whatever that is. Um, so it just made me focus and it made me want to do it because I wanted to be able to tell those people who kind of dismissed me as not a real architect that actually, yeah, Sonny,
Hmm.
I was a real architect. Um, so,
Yeah, because it's quite a weird one, isn't it? Where because I'm
mm,
just thinking now, like going straight into my part one when I get my part two done, but then it's kind of like where does it sort of end after you've obtained that title? Sort of what's next in a way after that step? Because they only really say, you get your architect title and the kind of world's your oyster from that point, isn't it? I guess after you've got the title, in a sense.
yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're actually part three qualified and can are registered as an architect and maybe a member of the RIBA as well, then sure, that opens doors for you.
Hmm.
Definitely, and all over the world, to be honest, especially if you have a second language. So
Yeah.
I suppose the only thing that is if you do stop at degree part one, then what are the benefits of that? I think there are many benefits to it, and we've talked about this in our earlier conversations. If you go on to do
Yeah.
diploma, then really the only logical route then, once you're doing your diploma, is that you then become an architect, regardless of whether you want to
Yeah.
do other things as well. But part one, I think, it can take you in all sorts of different directions, whether it's into media or
Hmm.
other forms of design, product design, advertising. You have proved that you're creative and you can commit yourself to projects and design. So I think there's a huge benefit in just doing the degree. Hmm.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many open sort of areas and aspects, and I think that's sort of what's inspired this podcast in a sense, is sort of really understanding and that architecture is not just an architect in a sense. Architecture covers so many different areas of industry, doesn't it? And I think especially if you are a part one, you get the chance to sort of open up, and you don't have to do the direct path, do you, in a sense?
No, except that don't forget, architect is a protected title. So not
Yeah,
you can't call yourself an architect unless you are registered with the Architects Registration Board.
yeah,
You know, people do call themselves architects of products, for example, or I don't know, engineering or something, other things which actually have
mm,
don't spring to mind really. But to call yourself an architect, you have to have walked the walk, and it's a protected title for that reason. And recently, you know, the
yeah.
RIBA or even the Architect Registration Board, they did actually haul someone over the coals for calling themselves an architect when they were not a qualified architect. You know, you just can't do it. They don't they don't take very lightly to that. But
Yeah,
um,
I've seen.
yeah, I think that, you know, there's when you look at life, when you look at the world, you see that there's a lot of visual things going on. A lot of
Mm,
things rely on their visual impact and being able to draw people in
yeah.
with visual messages is very important. And we do respond as human beings to those visual pointers. And being an architect is, I think, very
Mm.
much a part of that.
Was going to say, as I've sort of mentioned before, that you work at Delva Patman Redler. Could you give your sort of definition of what a party wall is?
A party wall, yes. So just to give a bit of background, the company that I work for, we specialise in neighbourly matters, which are
Yeah.
matters to do with property development as they relate to the neighbours. We cover rights to light, which is one of our core
Hmm.
businesses, and party walls is another part of our core business. We also do boundary dispute resolution. So a party wall, just to go back to your original question, is the separating wall between the properties owned by different people. So in a terrace of housing, for example, the walls separating the houses are
Yeah.
party walls. In a block of flats, the structures, the horizontal structures, the floors are the separating structures, and those are party structures. Yeah, so that's,
Okay.
but the Party Wall
Thanks very much for that.
Act covers not only structures and
Yeah.
walls, as I've just described, but also adjacent excavation. So digging foundations, digging basements, that's all covered by the Party Wall Act as well.
I've also noticed that you previously worked at Scott Brownrigg and EPR Architects. How
That's
did you
right,
sort of
yeah.
find these two experiences?
Yes. So Scott Brownrigg, they used to be Scott Brownrigg and Turner, and I worked in their Guildford head office as it was then, and also in Filton near Bristol on the MOD site there, which was very, very interesting. I was on site. And EPR Architects, yes, they're very well known, very big company of architects now. And yeah, I've got very good memories of working with them too. And in fact, working with EPR was my last job in an architect's office. Oh no, actually no, it wasn't quite, because I also worked for the Estates Design Office at Imperial College. So we
Hmm.
did some design work for the estates of the university, which that was very interesting. Very nice group of people I worked with there.
Was Scott Brownrigg your part two? Was it?
Mm,
Is that where you went?
no. Okay, so yes, I suppose they were. It's quite a long time ago now. It feels like a different a lifetime. Yes, in fact, I qualified at EPR. I was at EPR when I did my part three. So, so Scott Brownrigg,
Okay.
I was part two architect there. Yeah. So Scott Brownrigg was quite interesting because I came to Scott Brownrigg. I mean, CAD was a new thing in those days, if you can believe it. There was
Hmm.
life before CAD, and there were still drawing boards in the office. very much so. I mean, the architects worked on drawing boards, and I was part of a new
Yeah.
team of CAD technicians who were architects. And that was a very interesting aspect to my career because it was all very new and very innovative.
As you've sort of transitioned into the sort of the party wall and the sort of
Mm.
surveying side of the industry now, do you notice a difference between the workflow and the culture of architecture practice compared to, say, where you're working now?
Yeah, so I mean, architecture has really transformed. I would say it's actually going back again to the traditional way of architecture, where the architect is basically the conductor of the orchestra. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of design and build now. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say, where the architect now works for the contractor, and that was unheard of when I was training. It was very much, the architect
Hmm.
was the person who started and finished the whole project. But
Yeah.
now, of course, the architect's role is more in upfront design. The risk is, do you get what you thought you were going to get if you get rid of the architect halfway through the process? And I think a lot of people realize that the answer
Yeah.
is no. You have to keep the architect. You have to keep the architect on board to get what you want.
Yeah, it's really interesting, sort of how you were saying before about the servers and everything changing, and then in essence the sort of whole industry shifting as well throughout that sort of that time frame, and how
Yeah.
things are completely almost different to today. And then obviously with the added addition of COVID as well, how much COVID's influence on the world of work at the moment as well.
Yeah, completely. And the working from home, of course, that has meant that teams have been physically taken apart, but actually, through the media that we have now with Zoom and Teams and the thing that we're using now, Zencaster, to record this, these are
Yeah.
all new technologies, which they're not new, but of course, they are newly discovered. Um, and I think they're
Yeah.
just amazing. And of course, they will continue, I think, to transform the way that we work in the last 15 months away from the old traditional commuting into the office, the physical presence um,
Hmm.
is going to shift. It's going to have to because everyone wants it. Everyone wants to be able to get that elusive, it's been talked about for decades, the work-life balance. Now it actually seems to be
Yeah.
achievable.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good sort of culture shift, isn't it, into that trusting mentality and the sort of working from home aspect as well. I've also seen a few mentions of, say, a 3 or 4 hour, no, 3 or 4 day work week as well.
Yeah.
With, say, working from home and then a dropping day in the office. I think stuff like
Mm.
that, where it's a hybrid between the two, would be quite useful in the current climate as well.
Yeah, I think it's the holy grail in a way. It's what we all want. We want that work-life balance. We want to work more efficiently by commuting less,
Hmm.
by enjoying our work environment more, by being at home perhaps, where um, but a lot of people have missed the office. I mean, a lot of some of my colleagues have
Yeah.
missed it and they love going into the office. And yeah, to go into the office but not have to go in. Do you know what I mean? So you can have the option
Yeah.
working from home half the week, working in the office the other half of the week. I think it's perfect.
It's really interesting. Sort of talking previously about your placements in architecture, let's say it's Scott Brownrigg and EPR Architects. Do you find that having that prior experience has helped you with your career sort of going forward, let's say at Delva
Mm.
Patman Redler?
Yeah, definitely. It helps that I know I can read drawings. I mean, that goes without saying, I
Yeah.
suppose, but um, it's sometimes not that easy. And even I look at a drawing now and I think, what are they trying to communicate? I mean, at the end of the day, a drawing is about communication, um, and a
Hmm.
line is not just a line on a piece of paper, but it's information. You know,
Yeah.
and I think um, you have to always keep that in mind, being able to visualize in 3 dimensions. Of course, that's what architects do all the time. It's a very important part of your work that you can look at a 2-dimensional drawing and visualize in 3D. But the other thing, of course, is that I did do a stint 3 years as a building control officer, which was also a
Okay.
complete eye opener for me. Yeah, after I left and before I started at DPR, Delva Patman Redler, I did 3 years as a Wandsworth building control officer, and that was also, a very steep learning curve because, having done drawings all my life, to then actually
Yeah.
see not on a big, multi-million pound site such as the MOD procurement centre in Bristol, which is where I was on site, but the kind of muck and bullets, St George's Hospital, blocks of flats, everyone's rear extension, loft conversions, this kind of thing. You're actually seeing it happen, and it's also happening very quickly because people don't want to keep their roofs off for longer than
Wow.
is absolutely necessary. So, there's a lot of learning there, and it was a very good thing for me to do career-wise, but also, my own personal development, really, just to have that experience. So, yeah.
Would you would you recommend that experience to, say, if someone's going through a sort of a changing careers or something, to experience that first, or say if they're thinking about moving practices or wants to get a better understanding of the construction industry and building control, would you recommend someone goes into that field for a little bit and test the waters out?
Definitely. I think it would be a very good thing for somebody who's learning about building to do. Definitely.
Hmm.
If you're learning about design, if you're learning about construction, working on a building site, that's the other thing. Get out there, work on a building site. I mean, what better way to learn about building sites than to work on one?
Yeah, because I think that's one thing that's maybe missing from the sort of university scene, is because I remember when I left university, and then we smashed out all these concepts and we would really understand how to put a concept together, but taking that into a form of building and understanding how a building fits together, that's almost like a completely new area for me to personally learn, in a sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's sort of what's lacking, is how them things fit together at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it used to be, people used to be keen to work on building sites. You'd say, oh, I spent a summer as a bricklayer or something like that,
Hmm.
and so to give you that raw experience of working on a building site. So, and
Yeah.
it frames your narrative really of how a building is put together because you've worked on a building site. And it's not just about drawing
Hmm.
pictures of buildings. Not that, of course, you do need that.
It's a weird one, isn't it? Because the micro influences the macro and the macro influences the micro. So it's a sort of a
Yeah.
double edged sword in a sense, isn't it? You get one and it benefits the other all the time. But
Exactly, exactly. You
yeah, I
can't
always
have
think
one
that's
without
really
the other.
interesting.
And you see that's in a way that's the thing about the architect is that they see all of that. They see the macro and they see the
Hmm.
micro. Um, and you start with your site plan, you start with your planning regulations for that local area, and you finish with the paint color
Yeah.
inside, you know, the bedroom. So, and that's in some ways that's why architecture is so difficult because you have to know everything
Yeah.
about everything.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say, is if you say go to site and you're unsure and you try and sort of get in with everyone and not really know what you're talking about, then you can be deemed a sort of unsafe architect in a way if you don't understand it yourself. Um,
That's right.
and it's a really, you've just got to be the maestro in a sort of sense, haven't you? That
Yeah,
you know
and
what you're talking about.
exactly, and that's why generally you find that architects, lead architects, have got quite a few grey hairs because you know they're the other side of 50 and they've been around the block a few times. You do need that experience, you need that
Yeah.
knowledge. And if you don't know something, you also need to be wise enough to say, I don't know, and look it up or hand it over to an expert.
Yeah, I think you'd be crazy to even try to attempt anything like that. Such a great feat to learn everything.
Yeah, yeah,
And especially with the world so constantly changing and shifting as well, old materials become redundant and new materials come into the spotlight.
yeah.
There's so much change, isn't there?
Exactly, exactly.
I've also noted that you worked on the Crossrail in central London,
Mm-hmm.
that you were the surveyor. Could you sort of give us an insight into what that role sort of entailed and sort
Yeah.
of how that all worked?
So Crossrail, the Crossrail Act was, I think, 2008. Um, and of course, Crossrail is, among other things, a big deep tunnel underneath London through the West
Yeah.
End, through a large proportion of highly built up areas, highly commercial, very expensive residential areas. So working for Crossrail in that respect, we had to advise Crossrail on their obligations under the Party Wall Act and then to
Yeah.
implement those. And I worked on Crossrail on and off between, let's say, for 8 years, between 2010 and 2018, and it was great. I mean, I learned a lot there as well. I learned a lot about engineering because tunneling through
Hmm.
soil, primarily clay, at 50 meters depth underneath Mayfair is, there's a lot of engineering calculations that need to go on. But a
God.
lot of it was unknown, of course, because it was so deep. It was only when you came up with access to shafts or the actual stations themselves that people actually knew
Mm.
about Crossrail. And of course, it did have an impact. It had an impact on the working life of lots of people in London. But of course, the technology of tunnel boring machines under big cities or indeed anywhere, a tunnel
Mm.
boring machine can save you a lot of angst, in fact. And I think, well, I hope that it will be used a lot in HS2. I know it is. And of course, we've now
Oh
got
yeah.
the Tideway Tunnel. The Tideway Tunnel is the huge sewer that
Yeah.
runs underneath the Thames. I mean, who would have thought that that would even be possible? In the old days, you had to literally freeze the ground in order to be able to cut that deep without, of course, a risk of
God.
hurting people, injuring people. But nowadays, we've got something called a tunnel boring machine, which is an extraordinary piece of equipment that means you can just basically tunnel through soil and the sides don't cave in. You can put it anywhere, and underneath the Thames, of course, is the perfect way because you're not tunneling underneath anyone there. Um, you're not
Mm.
affecting any properties. Yeah.
That
So yeah, very
that
good.
must be a massive thing. That
Mm.
if you're coming underneath London and you've got all the sort of urban landscape above you, there
Mm.
must be a slight chance that someone's thinking, "Oh my god, it might collapse in here or something."
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it must have been a crazy experience to just even be in that far underneath London to be on site.
It's just amazing. And but what you find out, James, is that in fact you are weaving in and out of all the other tunnels that are around about the same level. So, the Jubilee line, the Northern line, the Piccadilly
Yeah.
line, they all intersect, they all crisscross above and below Crossrail. You've got some fairly deep sewers as well, I think, although perhaps not quite that deep. Yeah, there are a couple of other tunnels which are not actually part of the tube
Mm.
network, also at that level, unbelievably. Um, yeah, so you're weaving in and out, and they've done, of course, it's been they've done BBC documentaries to death on the subject, or YouTube. It's all on YouTube. You can just watch it from beginning to
Yeah.
end, and it's yeah, the engineering, of course, is extraordinary because how do you know where your tunnel is when it's 50 meters below ground? How do you know where it is? And the answer, of course, is through
God.
science and through these amazing things called automatic total stations. Now, an automatic total station can tell you where you are to within millimeters above and below ground. They're pretty amazing pieces of equipment. and it's all about
Wow.
shining light, or lasers, in fact, onto prisms and feeding that information back to computers. Couldn't do it without computers, I don't think.
Just be tunneling in the dark. I have no idea where you're going. I think if there were no
Yeah, in the
computers.
old days, I think it was a bit like that. Yeah.
Did you ever sort of come across a redundant tunnel? Because I know there's a few in, say, New York where they've just dug a tunnel and left it for a train station or something. Did you ever find that in London
Yeah,
when you were
so
there?
so there are things like that. There are sidings as well, where you dig a tunnel and then that's you just lay the tracks, and that's where the trains go to sleep at night. That sort of thing. Um, they did actually
Hmm.
bury, I think, one of the tunnel boring machine heads. Just it basically dug itself into the ground and is there embedded forevermore. There's that.
Wow.
Um, Yeah, but all sorts of cross passages. There was a lot
God.
of temporary works, of course, as well, where um, you've got the northbound or the east-west and then the west-east tunnels, and you've got to connect them
Hmm.
up somehow.
It's crazy. It's just all the stuff that you wouldn't think even has anything to do with architecture in a sense, but then you have to get someone to design the train station, don't you? After
Yep,
it's just
indeed, and that's where the architects do come in. Of
crazy.
course, also below ground, you've got all of the tunnels which they want to be suited, so that when you are on the Elizabeth line, you know that that's where you are. So below ground, the Elizabeth line is all
Okay, yeah.
uniform and all, the paneling and the finishes are all exactly the same. But then when you come above ground, that's when the architecture kicks in, and the above ground architecture is completely different depending on the station that you're at.
I was going to say as well, I was just wondering, do you think that prior to, well, sort of after leaving university, do you think there's a sort of gap between university and starting in practice? A sort of gap in knowledge where, maybe there's a bit of a jump?
Yeah, for sure. And as we talked about earlier, in the old days,
Hmm.
you'd go away and get a job on a building site, and that would go some way to closing that gap between learning, knowledge, learning as kind of a different thing from experience. And of course, the two together then give you knowledge and expertise, I suppose, in the end, if you stick at it. But yeah, I think there is a gap, and I think it's perhaps about people not wanting to go out and get their hands dirty a lot of the time. I think it's
Yeah.
very important that people should just get involved, get stuck in.
Sorry, the grand tour, wasn't it? The where they'd go and travel and sketch all the details and whatnot.
Yeah,
But, yeah,
that's
which
right.
I don't think they do that anymore though.
Yeah, sometimes they bring back actual pieces of buildings, which nobody's encouraging that these days. But certainly to sketch, that is free. If you sketch the
Hmm.
Colosseum at Rome, there's nobody stopping you from doing that.
So then, in regards to the gap,
Mm.
how do you think it could be sort of tackled? Just sort of get your hands dirty and crack on, sort of thing, or
So I don't think there's any kind of government initiative which can close
hmm.
that gap. It's down to the individual students themselves. What do they want from architecture? How can they best develop their creative skills? Um, so I think that's what it's all about wanting to get involved. The other thing is that, and I'm not suggesting that people necessarily rush off and do this now, but there are a few charities who are doing house building in parts of the world where you wouldn't normally necessarily get to work as a professional in this
Yeah.
country, um, but the charities are doing that. I've heard of that. I've heard of a few cases of that, and that would give you not just experience of architecture, it's not so much, but certainly building,
Hmm.
vernacular, how people use buildings. It's very, very important. Fitting the client's brief. That's what architects refer to it as. But it's basically, you should always be designing for the end user, the person who's going to be using
Yeah.
your building, your school, um, accommodation,
I think that
wherever.
is a really sort of interesting point on the sort of humanitarian architecture aspect of it. Because I think that if a lot of people did that, you'd have a lot more houses built in sort of other countries, and you'd get a lot of on-site knowledge sort of work into completely newer conditions instead of just sort of in the UK, for example. Um,
I mean, we build buildings here. A lot of it is determined by our weather.
yeah,
You know, you have to meet building regulations. These are minimum standards that you have to meet, and of course you have to meet them. You have to be prepared to design to meet minimum standards.
mm,
And we have, of course, the issue now, which is of climate devastation or global devastation through climate
yeah,
change, and tracing that back to the use of or the burning of fossil fuels and oil over the last few decades.
mm,
And you know, um, as architects, we have to recognize that global issue and respond accordingly. So people talk about embodied carbon,
oh yeah,
and that's a new phrase which you probably know what that is. It's basically no new buildings. Use the building you already have. It's like, what is the most eco-friendly clothing that you can buy? It's the clothing you already have.
yeah.
Don't go buy new clothes.
I have seen a lot
Sorry,
of
anyone in retail, I apologize. I apologize. But, if you've got a building there with foundations, make use of those
mm,
foundations, make use of that structure that's already there. That's the message that's coming through, I think, loud and clear. A lot of architects are embracing that.
yeah. I've seen a lot of initiatives come up recently. Say like ACAN is quite a big one. They're doing a series on, I think it's the circular economy, and that's breaking down all the sort of points of where we can be
Mm,
more sustainable and whatnot, which is quite an interesting watch. Um,
yeah.
and yeah, I think it's
Hmm.
definitely a really interesting, the whole embodied carbon, because I think that might actually bring out a new sort of form of architecture of repurposing and refitting these buildings to a new style.
Yes, indeed. Yes, yes. I mean, a problem with a lot of old buildings trying to repurpose them is that we have greater demand in terms of heating, ventilating, the servicing of buildings.
Mm,
And quite often there is not the space between floor to ceiling heights. I mean, I'm being very prosaic here now.
yeah,
So something has to be done to rediscover how we can be more creative of those spaces. I mean, we'll come up with it. We are
mm,
notoriously great at being the mothers of invention when there is a need for it.
yeah.
We can invent and create ourselves out of the mess that we've created ourselves into, I suppose. Um, and there are, greater minds than mine working on just that right now. So I've got great confidence that,
It'll all be okay
not great
eventually.
confidence. I hope that we will. Yeah, that's maybe not in my lifetime, but hopefully in my daughter's lifetime.
Mm.
Yeah.
So then, going back to sort of the whole education aspect, where do you think you learnt the most, whether it be in architect's practice or building control, or even sort of, do you see yourself still learning now? Is that, where do you think you've learnt the most from your past experiences?
Yes. Well, the phrase "every day's a school
Yeah,
day" is still applies to me. Yeah. And I think that's quite healthy. We're supposed to do, as architects, we're supposed to do CPD,
yeah,
continuing professional development. But even without having to, fill in your logbook
mm,
or fill it in online, actually, to keep inquiring, an inquiring mind is a good thing with architecture and with building. there are so many different aspects to construction, to property development,
Yeah.
not just architecture. Of course, the legal world, which I inhabit now more than I used to, is incredibly interesting. I would say that I learnt, of course, I learnt a lot in the firms that I worked in.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned just a two there. After that, I think definitely building control. I learned a huge amount there, but I'm still learning. I'm still learning about what people want, what developers want from their land, what can they have, what can they do with their land. That's very important. How can I help them to do what they want to do with their land? And equally, how can I keep them out of trouble by not upsetting the neighbours when they do what they want to do?
I was just going to say about when I started my part one, I was opened up to this sort of new world, and we did a lot of stuff in planning and in Greenbelt and all that sort of side of it. And it is really interesting to actually understand what you can build and what you can't build, and where you can build it and why you can build it in a sense, and then applying all of those constraints to the sort of end user in a sense. And it just sort of informs the architecture, doesn't it? So then, on a final note, if you were a graduate, or if you knew a graduate coming out of university now, what is one tip that you could give them for, say, securing a job or moving forward in their career of architecture?
Well, I think it's very difficult at the moment because the job market
Yeah.
is in a bit of turmoil because of COVID. So people who've asked me the same question, I've said, just take any job, get any job you can, and then from that position where you're at least earning money, maybe covering your rent and your expenses,
Yeah.
then look for something that you actually want. So, there's need to have, and then there's nice to have, of course, and the job of your dreams is very nice to have, but some people just need a job. And I would never say hold out for the job of your dreams and let
Yeah.
a job that will actually keep you at, let it go by. No, I don't think that's a good answer. That's not the right advice to give anyone. But when you've got a job that's keeping your head above water, by all means, look for your dream job, and take. Sometimes it's baby steps. Just take that job that's in the place where you want to work. Take that job that's with the firm you want to work with, or take that job that is in the department of the firm you want to work with. And always keep looking. Keep your eyes open. Look at architecture. Look at buildings.
Yeah.
I suppose do your homework as well. Research the companies that you want to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's some really sound advice. I think that's definitely correct in what you're saying there. You shouldn't wait for that dream job, because you could give up on an amazing opportunity where you gain loads of experience, and then that's only going to benefit you later down the line when you do apply for your dream job. So I think that's really some sound advice.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad you thought
Yeah.
so.
And then I think
Yeah.
on that note we'll end the podcast here. So thank you very much for joining me, Shirley.
You are
It's
very
been
welcome,
a
James.
pleasure.
Hmm.
So
Likewise.
yeah,
Yeah.
we'll end the podcast there.